The diner was a hollow shell of neon and stale coffee when Theodore noticed the trembling. He sat in his usual corner booth. A man whose tailored Italian wool overcoat and quiet, suffocating presence demanded a wide berth. When the waitress approached to refill his mug, her hand shook violently. A few drops of scalding liquid splashed onto the cracked formica table. She gasped, shrinking back as if expecting a backhand, and her frayed sleeve rode up to her elbow. Theodore's cold eyes locked onto the brutal purple-black finger marks branded into her pale skin. "Who?" Theodore asked, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that carried the weight of the city's underworld. "Put their hands on you?" Samantha closed her eyes, a single tear cutting through her exhaustion. "My father. And my brother did that," she whispered. The rain was a relentless percussion against the grimy windows of the Starlight Diner, a forgotten establishment clinging to the edge of the city's industrial district. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burning oil, strong black coffee, and the damp wool of the few late-night patrons seeking refuge from the storm. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed a low, erratic tune, occasionally flickering and casting harsh, pale shadows across the scuffed linoleum floor. In the farthest corner booth, with his back to the solid brick wall and his eyes commanding a clear view of both the entrance and the kitchen doors, sat Theodore. He was a man constructed of sharp angles and absolute stillness. His dark overcoat, cut from expensive fabric that looked entirely out of place in the grease-stained diner, was draped perfectly over his broad shoulders. A silver lighter, engraved with a solitary, intricate crest, rested near his right hand. He did not smoke inside, but the lighter was a tether to his reality, a small, weighty object he would occasionally turn over his knuckles when deep in thought. Theodore was not a man who frequented places like the Starlight for the culinary experience. He came here for the anonymity, for the quiet rhythm of normal lives ticking away, completely oblivious to the empire of shadows he ruled just a few miles away. He was tired. The weight of his syndicate, the constant, draining chess game of allegiances, betrayals, and territory, had settled deep into his bones. Across the diner, moving with a frantic, bird-like energy, was Samantha. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, but her eyes held the exhaustion of someone who had lived 3 lifetimes. Her pale blonde hair was tied back in a messy, practical knot, and her faded pink uniform hung loosely on her thin frame. Theodore had been coming to this diner every Tuesday night for a month, and he had spent that time quietly observing her. He was a predator by nature and by trade. His survival depended on his ability to read a room, to spot the weakness, the lie, the hidden blade. What he saw in Samantha was not deception, but a profound, paralyzing terror. Tonight, the terror was palpable. It radiated from her in waves. As she wiped down the counter, her shoulders were hunched, her head bowed as if trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. Every time the bell above the main door chimed, announcing a new arrival, she flinched. It was a microscopic movement, a sudden tightening of her jaw, a rapid intake of breath. But Theodore saw it. He watched as she forced a frail, brittle smile for a pair of weary truckers, her hands moving mechanically to pour their coffee. There was a man at the counter, a loud, obnoxious drunk whose voice slurred and boomed over the quiet hum of the diner. He kept trying to grab Samantha's apron strings as she walked past, making crude, wet-sounding jokes that made the other patrons avert their eyes in discomfort. Theodore watched the scene unfold with a chilling detachment. He saw the drunk reach out, his thick, unwashed fingers brushing against Samantha's hip. Samantha froze. Her breath hitched, and the tray she was carrying rattled violently. She didn't yell. She didn't slap his hand away. Instead, she folded inward, her eyes wide and glassy, completely paralyzed by a fear that seemed disproportionate to the drunk's clumsy harassment. It was the reaction of a trapped animal, someone who had learned the hard way that fighting back only made the pain worse. Theodore felt a cold, familiar anger uncoil in his chest. It was not the fiery, explosive rage of a lesser man, but a freezing, calculated fury. He did not tolerate indiscipline in his ranks, and he despised those who preyed on the defenseless. It offended his strict, albeit dark, sense of order. He slowly picked up his silver lighter, the metal cold against his skin. He tapped it once against the formica table. The sound was sharp, akin to a pistol hammer clicking into place. The sound cut through the ambient noise of the diner. The drunk paused, his hand still hovering near Samantha. He turned his heavy head toward the corner booth. Theodore did not move. He simply stared at the man. Theodore's eyes were dark, flat, and completely devoid of empathy. He projected a silent, suffocating aura of imminent violence. He didn't need to say a word. The message was etched into the lines of his face and the rigid posture of his body. The drunk blinked, the haze of alcohol momentarily piercing through. A primal instinct, the evolutionary alarm that warns a gazelle of a lion in the tall grass, flared in his foggy brain. He slowly pulled his hand back. Swallowing hard, he threw a crumpled dollar bill onto the counter, muttered a disjointed apology to the air, and stumbled out of the diner, disappearing into the heavy rain. Samantha released a long, shaky breath, leaning heavily against the counter for a fraction of a second before forcing herself upright. She didn't look at Theodore, but she knew what he had done. She quickly picked up the coffee pot, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle, and began her rounds. Theodore watched her approach his table, the rain continuing to batter the windows, masking the sound of her approaching footsteps. He noticed the way she favored her left side, the subtle wince that tightened her features with every step. The shadows in the diner seemed to cling to her, highlighting the bruised, hollow rings beneath her eyes. As she stopped at his booth, the scent of vanilla and fear washed over him, setting the stage for a revelation that would alter both of their lives irreparably. Samantha approached Theodore's booth with the coffee pot held in both hands, treating it like a fragile bomb. She kept her gaze fixed firmly on the chipped rim of his ceramic mug, terrified to meet his eyes. The air around this man always felt heavy, charged with a strange, static electricity that made her skin prickle. She was grateful for his silent intervention with the drunk at the counter, but gratitude did not override her deeply ingrained instinct to avoid men who radiated such overwhelming, quiet power. "Refill, sir?" she asked, her voice raspy and thin, barely louder than the hum of the overhead lights. Theodore nodded once, a minimal, precise movement. "Please," as she leaned forward to pour the steaming black liquid. A sudden sharp pain flared in her ribs. It was a blinding, breathtaking agony that caused her to gasp and flinch involuntarily. Her hand jerked. The heavy glass carafe clattered against the ceramic mug, and a splash of boiling hot coffee jumped the rim, landing squarely on the polished mahogany surface of the table, mere inches from Theodore's cuff. "Oh God," Samantha choked out, the panic setting in instantly. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, sir. Let me get a towel. Please, I didn't mean to." She was hyperventilating now, stepping back so quickly she almost tripped over her own feet. In her frantic retreat, the long, faded sleeve of her uniform snagged on the sharp metal corner of the napkin dispenser. The thin fabric tore with a sickening rip, pulling back all the way to her elbow. Theodore didn't move to wipe away the spilled coffee. His eyes were entirely focused on Samantha's exposed forearm. The diner's harsh fluorescent lighting offered no forgiveness. Stamped onto her pale, trembling skin was a constellation of deep, horrific bruises. They were mottled shades of violent purple, sickening yellow, and angry black. But it wasn't just the color that made Theodore's blood run cold. It was the shape. The bruises were perfectly formed. 4 distinct oval marks on one side, and a larger, thumb-shaped bruise on the other. It was the undeniable imprint of a large, brutal hand that had gripped her with enough crushing force to nearly shatter the bone. The silence in the corner booth became absolute, a vacuum that sucked the air from Samantha's lungs. She frantically clawed at her torn sleeve, trying to pull the fabric back down, her face burning with shame, and a terror so profound it made her physically nauseous. "Don't," Theodore said. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a commanding gravitational pull that made Samantha freeze. He slowly reached into his breast pocket and produced a pristine white linen handkerchief. He placed it over the spilled coffee, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Then, he raised his dark eyes to meet hers. For the first time, Samantha truly looked at him. She expected to see pity, or perhaps disgust, or the predatory gleam of a man who recognized vulnerability. Instead, she saw a terrifying, frozen wasteland. His eyes were the color of slate under a winter sky, and within them burned a cold, controlled fury that was far more intimidating than any shouting or violence she had ever known. "Sit down," Theodore commanded softly. It was not a request. Samantha swallowed hard, her throat feeling as if it were coated in sand. She cast a desperate, panicked glance toward the kitchen. but the short-order cook was busy scraping the grill, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the corner. Slowly, with shaking legs, she slid into the booth opposite him, perching on the very edge of the vinyl seat, ready to bolt. Theodore studied her face. He saw the fresh swelling along her jawline, expertly hidden by a dusting of cheap foundation. He saw the way she guarded her left side. "Who?" Theodore asked, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that seemed to vibrate against the diner's windows. "Put their hands on you." Samantha shook her head rapidly, her eyes darting toward the door. "No one. It was an accident. I fell down the stairs outside my apartment. It's nothing, sir, really. I should get back to work. Do not lie to me," Theodore said gently. The gentleness was worse than anger. It was the patience of a man who held all the cards and had all the time in the world. "I am not a fool, Samantha. I know what a fall looks like, and I know what the grip of a violent coward looks like." He paused, letting the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. "Who?" The dam broke. The exhaustion, the pain, the relentless, suffocating fear that had been her constant companion for months finally overwhelmed her defenses. She squeezed her eyes shut, and a single, heavy tear escaped, cutting a clean track through the cheap makeup on her cheek. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold her shattered pieces together. "My father and my brother did that," she whispered, the words tearing from her throat like rusted barbed wire. Theodore did not flinch, but his jaw tightened so fiercely that a muscle ticked visibly beneath his skin. In his world, a world steeped in blood and necessary violence, there was a strict, unbreakable code. Family was sacred. You protected your blood with your life. The idea of a father and a brother raising a hand to their own flesh and blood, to a fragile, hard-working woman like Samantha, was not just a crime. It was an abomination. It was a sickness that needed to be eradicated. "Why?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. Samantha let out a broken, pathetic sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Because I didn't have the money," she choked out, opening her eyes to look at her hands, twisted tightly in her lap. "Because they gamble. Because they use and they drink and they gamble some more. And when the loan sharks came, when the men in the dark cars showed up at our door threatening to break their legs, they told them I would pay." She looked up at Theodore, her eyes completely devoid of hope. "They sold me out. They took my savings. They took my tips. And when that wasn't enough, my brother grabbed me." She pointed a shaking finger at the bruise on her arm. "He grabbed me and told me I had to work it off. For them, the men they owe." Theodore leaned back slowly against the red vinyl booth. The diner, the rain outside, the humming lights, everything faded away, leaving only the cold, hard calculus of the underworld. He knew the ecosystem of the city's shadows better than anyone. "Who do they owe, Samantha?" Theodore asked, his tone shifting from gentle inquiry to the sharp, focused edge of a commander gathering intelligence. "They call themselves the Vipers," she whispered, shivering at the name. Theodore's eyes darkened. The Vipers were a chaotic, ruthless gang that operated on the eastern docks. They had no code, no honor, dealing in human misery and cheap narcotics. They were animals, and they had their hooks in the girl sitting across from him. Theodore reached out, his large, calloused hand gently touching the table inches from her trembling fingers. "Go back to work, Samantha," Theodore said quietly. "Finish your shift. Go home and lock your door." Samantha looked at him, confused and terrified by the sudden shift in his demeanor. "What? What are you going to do?" Theodore picked up his silver lighter, slipping it into his pocket. He looked at her, and for a fleeting second, the coldness in his eyes was replaced by a solemn, unbreakable vow. "I am going to make sure," he said, "that no one ever puts their hands on you again." The heavy iron gates of the Theodore family estate parted silently as the armored sedan rolled up the long driveway. Rain lashed against the car windows, but inside, the silence was absolute. Theodore's mind burned with the image of Samantha's bruised arm, a glaring, ugly stain on his conscience. He ordered men broken, but never the innocent. Waiting on the marble steps of the brightly lit foyer was Elias, his underboss. "My study," Theodore commanded, sweeping past him into the house. "Bring me everything we have on the Viper's loan activities on the east side. I need names, a father and a son." Find the last name of the blonde waitress at the Starlight Diner. 10 minutes later, Elias placed a thin manila folder on the mahogany desk in Theodore's study. Her name is Samantha Hayes, Elias reported. The men in question are Arthur and Marcus Hayes. They owe $80,000 to Silas the Rat Thorne. Theodore's jaw clenched. And how do two unemployed addicts plan to pay? Elias hesitated. They don't plan to pay with money, sir. Silas Thorne agreed to wipe their slate clean. They signed a contract, Theodore. They signed Samantha over. She's scheduled to be picked up tonight, after her shift ends. The crystal tumbler in Theodore's hand shattered. The crack echoed sharply, raining jagged shards and expensive bourbon onto the desk. A thin line of blood welled across his palm. But he didn't blink. The unnatural betrayal of a family selling their own flesh and blood into horror defied the natural order. Elias, Theodore said, his voice a blade of pure ice. Gather the men. The quiet ones. Silas Thorne is not collecting any debts tonight. Elias nodded. And the father and brother? Find them, Theodore ordered, wrapping his bleeding hand tightly in a towel. Pull them out of whatever gutter they are hiding in. Bring them here. Break their legs if you must, but keep them alive. I have something to say to them before they disappear. The relentless downpour had turned the alleyway behind the Starlight Diner into a slick, treacherous tunnel of shadows and refuse. The smell of rotting garbage mingled with the metallic tang of rain hitting rusted fire escapes. Samantha pushed through the heavy metal back door of the diner, her shoulders slumped, her entire body aching from the grueling shift. The rusted hinges shrieked in protest, a sound that usually made her wince. But tonight, she was too exhausted to care. She pulled her thin, faded trench coat tighter around her frail frame, trying to ward off the biting November chill. The single bulb above the door flickered erratically, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the wet pavement. She just wanted to get to her ancient, rusted sedan parked at the far end of the alley, lock the doors, and collapse. Her mind kept wandering back to the dark-eyed man in the corner booth. Theodore. She didn't know his name, but the memory of his cold, terrifying promise sent a complicated shiver down her spine, a mixture of deep dread and an unfamiliar, microscopic spark of hope. She took 3 steps into the alley when the shadows detached themselves from the brick wall. Shift's over, Sammy, a voice rasped. Samantha froze. The blood drained from her face, leaving her pale as a ghost beneath the flickering yellow light. She knew that voice. It was the sound of her nightmares, the soundtrack to her ruined life. A figure stepped into the meager circle of light. It was Marcus, her older brother. He looked entirely wretched. His clothes were soaked and hung loosely on his gaunt, emaciated frame. His eyes were wide, frantic, and unnervingly bright, the unmistakable look of a man high on cheap stimulants and driven by desperate panic. He was shivering violently, but not from the cold. Marcus, Samantha breathed, taking a cautious step backward, her hand instinctively reaching for the heavy metal door she had just closed, but it had clicked, locked behind her. What are you doing here? You know you're not supposed to be here. Change of plans, little sister, Marcus said, his voice a jittery, rapid-fire staccato. He rubbed his face aggressively with trembling hands. Dad and I, we figured it out. We fixed the problem, but we need your help. Just one last time, Sammy. Just one last favor for your family. Samantha's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her bruised ribs. She looked past Marcus, her eyes straining in the darkness. Parked at the mouth of the alley, its engine idling with a low, menacing purr, was a dark, battered van. The headlights were off, but she could see the glow of a cigarette ember from the driver's side window. The vipers. Panic, cold and sharp as cracked glass, pierced her chest. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, Marcus. You didn't. Tell me you didn't. Marcus lunged forward, his movements jerky and unpredictable. He grabbed her left arm, the same arm he had bruised days ago. Samantha screamed, a short, sharp cry of pure agony as his fingers dug into the healing, tender flesh. Shut up, he hissed, his face inches from hers, his breath smelling of decay and cheap alcohol. Don't you make a scene, you stupid girl. Do you know what they'll do to us? Do you know what Silas will do to me if I don't deliver you? He's going to skin me alive, Sammy. You owe us. We put a roof over your head. You sold me, she sobbed, struggling desperately against his grip. kicking at his shins. But the adrenaline of fear and drugs gave Marcus a terrifying, wiry strength. He began dragging her toward the waiting van. "Let me go. Please, Marcus, they'll kill me." "They ain't gonna kill you," Marcus snarled, ripping her coat as he yanked her forward. "They just want you to work it off. It's just a few years, Sammy. You can do it. You're strong. Now walk." The van's side door slid open with a heavy, metallic clang. Two large men stepped out into the rain. They wore heavy leather jackets adorned with the coiled snake emblem of the Vipers. One held a coil of thick zip ties. The other had a dirty cloth in his hand. They were smiling. Samantha's struggles became frantic, feral. She clawed at her brother's face, screaming for help, praying that someone in the diner would hear. But the rain drowned out her cries, and the heavy brick walls absorbed her terror. She was 10 feet from the van. 5 feet. The men reached out for her. Suddenly, the mouth of the alley was flooded with a blinding, explosive light. 4 identical, heavily armored black SUVs had silently turned off the main street, their high-beam halogens pinning the Viper's van against the brick walls like a cockroach under a spotlight. The sheer, overwhelming brightness forced Marcus and the Viper thugs to shield their eyes, momentarily blinding them. Before they could adjust, the doors of the SUVs opened in perfect, synchronized unison. Men poured out into the rain. They didn't yell. They didn't run. They moved with a terrifying, disciplined precision, fanning out to block the alley exit entirely. They wore dark suits under long coats, and the rain gleamed off the suppressed muzzles of the heavy, matte black weapons they carried. The Viper thugs froze, the zip ties slipping from their hands. They were street brawlers, bullies who preyed on the weak. They were suddenly entirely out of their depth, staring down the barrel of a highly organized, professional army. Marcus dropped Samantha's arm as if it were on fire, stumbling backward into the brick wall, his mouth opening and closing in silent, wide-eyed terror. Samantha collapsed onto the wet pavement, gasping for air, clutching her throbbing arm. She looked up through the driving rain. From the lead SUV, a figure emerged. He moved slowly, deliberately, ignoring the storm completely. As he stepped into the glaring halo of the headlights, Samantha recognized the sharp cut of the overcoat, the shadow of the fedora, and the terrifying, absolute stillness of his presence. It was Theodore. He walked down the alley, the water splashing around his polished shoes. His men parted for him silently. He didn't look at the Viper thugs, who were currently raising their hands in desperate surrender, their bravado entirely evaporated. He didn't look at the trembling, pathetic figure of Marcus sliding down the brick wall. Theodore walked straight to Samantha. He stopped in front of her, towering over her frail form on the wet concrete. He slowly removed his dark leather gloves, tucking them into his pocket. Then, he crouched down, the expensive fabric of his coat dragging in the filthy puddles, completely unconcerned by the ruin of his clothes. He reached out his bare hand. Samantha flinched, a knee-jerk reaction born of trauma, but Theodore didn't pull back. He kept his hand steady, palm up, offering it to her. "I told you," Theodore said, his voice a deep, resonant hum that cut through the sound of the storm, "that no one would ever put their hands on you again." Samantha looked at his hand, then up into his slate-gray eyes. The cold, terrifying wasteland she had seen in the diner was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective steel. Trembling, completely overwhelmed, she reached out and placed her small, bruised hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, and astonishingly gentle. He pulled her to her feet, shielding her from the rain and the terrifying men in the alley with his own body. "Put him in the trunk," Theodore said quietly, not looking back. He was looking at Samantha, ensuring she was steady on her feet. 2 of Theodore's men grabbed Marcus by the arms, dragging him kicking and screaming toward the rear SUV. "Sammy! Sammy, tell them who I am. I'm your brother." Marcus shrieked, his voice cracking in absolute panic. Theodore finally turned his head. He looked at Marcus being shoved into the darkness of the trunk. "You were her brother," Theodore corrected, his voice devoid of any human warmth. "Tonight, you are nothing but a debt." He turned back to Samantha, placing a gentle hand on her uninjured shoulder, guiding her toward his car. "Come, it is time to settle your accounts." Sitting rigidly on the burgundy leather sofa in Theodore's study were Arthur and Marcus Hayes. They looked like terrified, wet rats dragged into a lion's den. Arthur's hands shook incessantly, clutching a dirty flat cap to his chest. Beside him, Marcus sat in a sullen, terrified silence, still shivering from the rough handling in the alley. The heavy oak doors opened, and Theodore walked in. The atmosphere in the room instantly plummeted. He wore a crisp, dark suit that accentuated his broad shoulders. He tossed a manila folder casually onto the low table in front of them. Grainy surveillance photos of Arthur at the Viper's underground tables spilled out. $80,000 to Silas Thorne, Theodore stated, his voice dangerously cold. You gambled away your house. When the well ran dry, you gambled your daughter. Arthur flinched, his face turning gray. We were desperate. They were going to break my legs. What was I supposed to do? You were supposed to be a father, Theodore said with absolute revulsion. He stopped in front of Marcus, grabbed the front of his soaked shirt, and hauled him to his feet. And you share her blood. Instead of protecting her, you bruised her flesh to save your own coward's skin. Theodore shoved Marcus violently backward onto the sofa. Listen to me carefully, Theodore commanded, his eyes narrowing into lethal slits. In my world, a betrayal of blood is punishable by death. If I were acting according to my nature, neither of you would leave this room alive. But killing you would cause her pain. Arthur began to weep, a pathetic whimpering sound. Please, God, I'll do anything. This is my judgment, Theodore announced. You are leaving this city tonight. You will be driven to the state line. You will never contact Samantha again. You will never step foot within these borders for as long as you draw breath. Marcus stammered in panic. But the Vipers. Silas Thorne will hunt us down. Theodore locked eyes with him, projecting an aura of pure terror. The Vipers are no longer your concern. I am buying your debt and her freedom. If Silas Thorne comes looking, he will find me. But if I ever see your faces again, I will not exile you a second time. I will bury you. Am I understood? The sheer absolute certainty of his threat crushed them. They nodded frantically. Elias, Theodore called out. Take them to the border. Strip them of any cash and phones. Then, prepare the cars. We are paying a visit to the docks. The warehouse on the eastern docks was a rusted, corrugated iron monstrosity that stank of dead fish, diesel fuel, and unwashed bodies. It was the nerve center for the Vipers, a gang that operated more like a rabid dog pack than an organized syndicate. Inside, the massive space was a chaotic circus of illicit activity. Heavy metal music blasted from blown-out speakers, attempting to drown out the sounds of frantic machinery processing, cheap narcotics, and the raucous shouts of men huddled around illegal gambling tables. The air was thick with blue smoke and the sharp, chemical tang of their product. At the far end of the warehouse, elevated on a makeshift platform constructed from stolen shipping pallets, sat Silas the Rat Thorne. He was a gaunt, twitchy man with deeply pockmarked skin, a gold-capped tooth, and eyes that constantly darted around the room, full of paranoid, malicious energy. He was currently interrogating a terrified dock worker over a missing crate, casually twirling a rusted butterfly knife between his stained fingers. The heavy loading bay doors at the front of the warehouse didn't just open. They were forced apart with a violent, screeching mechanical groan. The blasting music cut off abruptly. The shouting died down. Every Viper thug in the warehouse turned toward the entrance, hands reaching for weapons tucked into waistbands or resting on tables. Through the opening strode Theodore. He didn't run, and he didn't sneak. He walked into the heart of his enemy's territory with the slow, deliberate stride of a king surveying a conquered, filthy province. He was flanked by Elias and 6 of his most elite men. They wore identical black suits and overcoats, an unnerving, stark contrast to the ragged leather and grime of the Vipers. Theodore's men carried highly customized, suppressed submachine guns, held at a disciplined, low-ready position. They didn't aim at anyone, but the threat of overwhelming, precise violence was absolute. A heavy, terrified silence descended upon the warehouse. The Vipers were numerous, but they were undisciplined street fighters. They recognized the emblem on Theodore's silver lighter when he casually flipped it open to inspect the flame before snapping it shut. They recognized the man who controlled the city's true underworld. Theodore walked straight down the center aisle, ignoring the thugs who hastily scrambled out of his path. He didn't look left or right. His slate-gray eyes were locked entirely on Silas Thorne, who had frozen on his pallet throne, the butterfly knife suddenly still in his hand. Theodore stopped 10 feet from the platform. He stood perfectly still, letting his presence fill the cavernous space, sucking the oxygen from the room. "Theodore," Silas rasped, his voice betraying a slight tremor despite his attempt at a cocky grin. He slowly stood up, trying to project authority he didn't possess. "To what do we owe the honor? You're a long way from the nice, clean high-rises uptown. This is Viper territory." Theodore did not smile. He didn't acknowledge the territorial claim. He reached into his overcoat and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. He tossed it underhanded. It landed with a solid thud at Silas's feet on the wooden pallet. $80,000, Theodore said, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet warehouse, in unmarked, non-sequential bills. "Count it if you wish, though I assure you, my ledgers are far more accurate than yours." Silas stared at the envelope, his paranoid eyes darting to Theodore, then to Elias, then back to the money. I don't understand. We don't have any business together. You don't owe me money. I don't." Theodore agreed, his tone dangerously flat. "But Arthur and Marcus Hayes do." Silas's eyes widened in realization, and a greedy, ugly sneer crept across his face. "Ah, the Hayes junkies. Yeah, they were into me deep. But you're a little late, Theodore. We already renegotiated their debt. They settled up tonight, paid in full." "I know how they paid," Theodore said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a physical vibration that Silas could feel in his chest. "I know about the contract. I know about the girl." Silas puffed out his chest, attempting to stand his ground. "She belongs to the Vipers now. A signed contract is a signed contract. We operate on rules down here, same as you. The girl is collateral. She's going to earn that 80 grand back. On her back." In one of my... Theodore didn't shout. He didn't raise his hand. He simply took one half step forward. The movement was so sudden, so laced with predatory intent, that Silas flinched violently, knocking over his own chair in his haste to scramble backward. Elias and Theodore's men didn't move a muscle, their discipline holding the entire warehouse hostage. "Do not finish that sentence," Theodore whispered. The whisper carried further than a scream. It was filled with a dark, terrifying promise of agonizing death. "You will never speak her name. You will never think of her." "The contract is void." Silas swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling. He looked down at the envelope of cash, then up at the suppressed weapons trained vaguely in his direction. He was a rat, and rats understood when they were cornered by a lion. "That envelope," Theodore continued, his voice returning to its cold, measured cadence, "contains $80,000. It is the exact amount owed to you by the Hayes men. Consider their debt paid in full. Consider the contract purchased. You're buying a waitress?" Silas asked, genuine confusion breaking through his fear. "Why? What is she to you?" "She is under my protection," Theodore stated simply. It was a declaration that altered the fabric of the city's underworld. To claim someone under his protection meant that any harm brought to them was an act of war against his entire syndicate. Theodore turned his head slightly, his eyes sweeping over the surrounding Viper thugs. They shrank back under his gaze. "I am taking the contract, Silas. Hand it over." Silas hesitated for a fraction of a second, his pride warring with his survival instinct. Survival won. He reached into his leather jacket with shaking fingers, pulling out a crumpled, stained piece of paper. It was the desperate, horrific document Arthur Hayes had signed. Silas tossed it down to the concrete floor. Elias stepped forward, retrieved the paper, and handed it to Theodore. Theodore didn't even look at it. He folded it neatly and placed it in his breast pocket. "We are done here," Theodore said. He turned his back on Silas Thorne, a blatant display of absolute disrespect and dominance, knowing Silas was too cowardly to strike him from behind. As Theodore reached the loading bay doors, he paused and looked over his shoulder. "Silas!" Theodore called out. Silas jumped. "If any of your men are ever seen within 5 blocks of the Starlight Diner, or if I ever hear a whisper of you looking for Samantha Hayes, I will not bring money next time. I will bring gasoline, and I will burn this warehouse to the ground with you inside it. Are we clear?" Silas Thorne, clutching the $80,000 like a shield, nodded rapidly, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Crystal clear, Theodore." "We never heard of her." Theodore walked out into the freezing night, the heavy doors screeching shut behind him. He had stepped into the filth, paid the devil his due, and severed the chains binding Samantha to the darkness. Now, he had to tell her she was free. The Starlight Diner was closed. The bright neon open sign was dark, casting no reflection on the wet pavement. Inside, only a few harsh kitchen lights remained on, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Samantha was alone, sweeping the floor behind the counter. Her movements were slow, robotic, driven only by muscle memory and the desperate need to keep moving so she wouldn't have to think. Her left arm throbbed a relentless, dull ache where Marcus had grabbed her, a brutal reminder of the nightmare in the alley. The image of Theodore stepping out of the glaring headlights, his dark coat sweeping over the wet concrete, played on a continuous, looping reel in her mind. He had saved her. The terrifying, quiet man who drank his coffee black and watched the world with dead eyes had stepped in front of the wolves and pulled her back from the abyss. But where was he now? What happened to her father? To Marcus? The uncertainty was a heavy, suffocating blanket. She knew with a chilling certainty that men like Theodore didn't perform miracles for free. There was always a cost. She swept a pile of dirt into the dustpan, a tear slipping silently down her cheek, bracing herself for whatever horrible debt she now owed the Mafia Boss. A gentle tapping on the glass of the front door made her jump, the broom clattering to the floor. She spun around, her heart hammering. Standing outside the locked glass door, barely visible in the shadows of the awning, was Theodore. He was alone. Samantha hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. She slowly walked to the door, her hands shaking as she turned the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open. The biting wind rushed in, carrying the scent of rain and expensive wool. "May I come in?" Theodore asked softly. He didn't push past her. He waited for her permission, a small gesture of respect that felt incredibly alien in her world. "Yes. Yes, of course, sir," Samantha stammered, stepping back to let him enter. She quickly locked the door behind him, suddenly feeling intensely vulnerable in the empty diner. Theodore stood in the center of the room. He looked exhausted. The sharp, terrifying aura he had projected in the alley and the warehouse was gone, replaced by a profound, heavy weariness. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a folded, crumpled piece of paper. He placed it gently on the nearest table, directly under a hanging light bulb. "Sit, Samantha," he said, gesturing to the booth beside the table. She sat, her eyes fixed nervously on the paper. Theodore remained standing, leaning slightly against the opposite booth, giving her space. "I visited the men on the docks tonight," Theodore began, his voice a low, steady rumble in the quiet diner. "A man named Silas Thorne. I believe you are familiar with him." Samantha flinched at the name, squeezing her eyes shut. "Yes, your father and your brother owed him $80,000, Theodore continued, stating the facts with a clinical detachment to spare her the emotional brutality of it. "And to erase that debt, they signed a contract. They signed you over to Thorne." Theodore pointed a long, impeccably manicured finger at the paper on the table. "That is the contract." Samantha stared at it. It looked so innocuous, just a stained piece of paper, but it contained the destruction of her life. She felt sick. "I bought it," Theodore said quietly. Samantha's head snapped up, her eyes wide with terror and confusion. You bought it? You paid them $80,000? Her breathing hitched, panic spiraling out of control. "Why? I don't have that kind of money. I can't pay you back. I work 2 jobs and I can barely afford rent. What do you want from me? Please, tell me what I have to do." She was hyperventilating, the tears flowing freely now. She thought she had traded one monster for a richer, more powerful one. She braced herself for the demand, for the price of her soul. "Samantha," Theodore said, his voice sharper now, demanding her attention to stop her panic spiral. "Look at me." She forced herself to look into his slate-gray eyes. They were not predatory. They were solemn, and strangely sad. Theodore reached into his pocket again and pulled out his silver lighter. He snapped it open, a bright yellow flame springing to life. He picked up the contract by the corner, held it over an empty ceramic ashtray on the table, and touched the flame to the paper. Samantha gasped as the paper caught fire. The flames quickly consumed the document, turning the horrific signatures of her father and brother into curling black ash. The ash crumbled into the tray, a literal destruction of her darkest nightmare. Theodore snapped the lighter shut, plunging the table back into relative shadow. "You owe me nothing," Theodore said, his voice returning to a gentle, absolute certainty. "The debt is paid. The contract is ash. Silas Thorne and the Vipers will never look your way again. You are free." Samantha stared at the pile of ash, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what had just happened. "Nothing?" she whispered, her voice trembling violently. People don't do things like this for nothing. Why did you do it?" Theodore looked away from her, staring out the dark window at the rain-slicked street. "Because I live in a world governed by monsters, Samantha," he said quietly, almost speaking to himself. "I govern those monsters. I see the worst of what men are capable of every single day. But what your father and brother did, it offended me. Family is meant to protect. When I saw what they did to you, I had the means to correct that wrong. So, I corrected it." He turned back to her. "You do not owe me money. You do not owe me favors. You only owe it to yourself to live a life free of fear." Samantha's hands flew to her mouth, a harsh, ugly sob tearing from her throat. She wasn't just crying from relief. She was crying for the profound, tragic loss of her family. She was crying because a feared mafia boss, a stranger in a dark coat, had shown her more genuine care and protection in one night than her own flesh and blood had shown her in a lifetime. "Where are they?" she managed to choke out between sobs. "My dad, Marcus? They are gone," Theodore said, his tone uncompromising. "I had them escorted out of the city. They have been told that if they ever return, or if they ever attempt to contact you, they will face the consequences of my anger. They chose to run. You will never see them again." It was a brutal truth, but a necessary amputation. Samantha buried her face in her hands, weeping uncontrollably. She mourned the father she wished she had, and the brother who used to protect her when they were children. But beneath the grief, a tiny, fragile seed of profound relief began to take root. She didn't have to look over her shoulder anymore. She didn't have to fear the knock on the door. Theodore did not try to comfort her. He did not touch her or offer hollow platitudes. He simply stood there in the quiet diner, a silent, immovable guardian, anchoring her as the storm of her old life finally broke and washed away, leaving the terrifying, beautiful blank slate of true freedom in its wake. 6 months later, the oppressive November rain had been entirely replaced by the bright, hopeful sunshine of late May. The city seemed to soften under its warmth. Samantha stood outside her new corner storefront, the Haven Bakery and Cafe. The past 6 months had been the hardest, yet most profoundly liberating period of her life. The silence left behind by her father and brother was initially deafening. But the Vipers never came. The suffocating terror slowly evaporated, replaced by a tentative peace. She had quit the graveyard shift, saved every penny from a daytime baking job, and secured a miraculously smooth business loan. As she wiped down the tables inside, she caught her reflection in the glass of the pastry case. The hollow, terrified girl was gone. She stood tall, her posture completely transformed. The bruises long faded. Across the street, parked discreetly under an oak tree, was a sleek black sedan with tinted windows. It appeared a few times a week, a silent, watchful presence. Samantha knew exactly who it belonged to. Initially, the unseen protection had made her nervous, leaving her waiting for Theodore to collect his favor. But she soon realized the truth. He truly wanted nothing from her. His protection was a shield, held at a respectful distance, allowing her to build her life without fear. She looked out the front window. The black sedan was gone. Samantha felt incredibly safe, yet lonely in her gratitude. She had never properly thanked him. She hoped, silently, as she dusted the pastries with powdered sugar, that one day the terrifying man in the dark would step into her light, just long enough for her to say thank you. The grand opening of the Haven Bakery and Cafe was a quiet, resounding success. For 3 weeks, a steady stream of locals had made Samantha's little corner shop their morning ritual. The bell above the door chimed constantly, announcing the arrival of construction workers seeking strong coffee, mothers with strollers buying sweet rolls, and elderly couples sharing a slice of pie. The air was always thick with laughter, the clatter of ceramic mugs, and the overwhelming scent of vanilla and baked butter. It was a Tuesday afternoon, just past the lunch rush. The bakery was quiet, the late afternoon sun painting warm, rectangular patches of light on the wooden floor. Samantha was behind the counter, humming softly to the radio as she carefully piped white frosting onto a batch of carrot cupcakes. She was exhausted, a bone-deep tiredness that came from waking up at 4 a.m. every day. But it was a good exhaustion. It was the exhaustion of purpose. The cheerful bell above the door chimed. "Just a minute, I'll be right with you," Samantha called out cheerily, expertly finishing the swirl of frosting on the last cupcake before wiping her hands on her flour-dusted apron. She looked up, freezing mid-motion. Standing in the doorway, framed by the bright afternoon sunlight, was Theodore. He looked different. The terrifying, sharp-edged aura that had defined him in the diner and the alley was muted. He wasn't wearing his heavy, intimidating overcoat or the fedora that cast shadows over his eyes. Instead, he wore a simple, expertly tailored gray suit, no tie, the collar of his white shirt slightly open. He looked less like a mafia boss and more like a weary, successful businessman who had just stepped out of a long board meeting. But his eyes, those slate gray, intensely observant eyes, were exactly the same. The bakery suddenly felt very still. The soft music from the radio seemed to fade into the background. Theodore stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him. He didn't approach the counter immediately. He took a moment to look around the small shop. He observed the freshly painted walls, the meticulously clean display cases, the small, mismatched wooden tables. He took in the smell of the yeast and the sugar. Finally, his eyes settled on Samantha. He saw the flower on her cheek, the genuine light in her eyes, the confident set of her shoulders. A microscopic softening occurred around his eyes, the closest thing to a smile Samantha had ever seen on his face. He walked slowly to the counter. Samantha's heart was beating fast, but not from fear. It was an overwhelming surge of profound gratitude. She didn't shrink back. She stood tall, meeting his gaze directly. "Hello, Samantha," Theodore said, his deep voice filling the small space. It lacked the cold rumble of intimidation. It was simply a greeting. "Hello," she replied, her voice remarkably steady. "Welcome to the Haven." Theodore looked down at the display case, studying the neat rows of pastries. "It is a fitting name. You have built something beautiful here." "I had a very solid foundation to build it on," Samantha said softly, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air between them. "Thanks to an investor who cleared the site for me." Theodore met her eyes, understanding the metaphor perfectly. He didn't wave off her gratitude, nor did he boast. He simply nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement of the life he had saved and the life she had built. "I am glad to see you thriving," he said. "I never got to say thank you," Samantha blurted out, the words rushing to the surface. She stepped closer to the counter, leaning in slightly. "Properly, I mean. For the money. For the contract. For my family. For everything. You gave me my life back. And you didn't ask for a single thing in return. I don't know how to ever repay you." Theodore looked at her, his expression serious but gentle. "There is no repayment required, Samantha. As I told you, you owed me nothing. The act itself was the payment." He paused, looking around the bright, sunlit cafe. "My world is complicated. It is dark, and it requires dark actions to maintain order. But sometimes, very rarely, I am afforded the opportunity to do something purely good. To see this," he gestured to the bakery, and then to her, "to see you safe and whole, and standing in the light, that is a rare currency in my life. It is more than enough." Samantha felt a lump form in her throat. She realized then the true nature of his unthinkable act. For a man surrounded by brutality and transactional relationships, performing an act of pure, selfless grace was the ultimate rebellion against his own dark nature. "Well," Samantha said, clearing her throat, forcing a watery smile as she reached for a pristine white ceramic mug. "Even if there's no debt, the least I can do is offer you a cup of coffee. Black, right?" Theodore's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. "Yes, black is fine." She poured the coffee, her hands steady, a stark contrast to the trembling girl in the diner who had spilled boiling liquid on his table. She placed it carefully on the counter, then used a pair of silver tongs to select a large, perfectly flaky, chocolate-filled croissant. She placed it on a small plate next to the coffee. "On the house," she said firmly. "And if you try to pay for it, I might have to have my own goons throw you out." A short, low chuckle escaped Theodore's lips, a sound so unexpected and genuine it startled Samantha. It transformed his face entirely, stripping away the years and the weight of his crown, revealing the weary, human man beneath the myth. I wouldn't dare test your security, Theodore said, his eyes gleaming with a rare quiet amusement. He picked up the coffee mug, inhaling the rich aroma, and took a slow sip. He nodded appreciatively. Excellent. He stood at the counter, a creature of the dark, comfortably resting in the sanctuary of the light. They didn't speak much after that. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer filled with terror or intimidation. It was a profound, comfortable quiet born of mutual respect and an unspoken understanding. Theodore finished his coffee and ate the pastry. When he was done, he stepped back from the counter, adjusting his jacket. He looked at Samantha one last time, a silent farewell to the groom and the girl he had saved, and a nod of profound respect to the woman she had become. Take care of yourself, Samantha, Theodore said softly. You too, she replied, her heart full. He turned and walked out the door, the cheerful bell chiming his departure. Samantha watched through the front window as he crossed the street, stepping into the waiting black sedan. The car pulled away, merging smoothly into the city traffic, disappearing back into the shadows. Samantha turned back to her bakery, wiping down the counter where he had stood. The faint smell of his expensive wool coat lingered for a moment, mingling with the scent of vanilla and fresh bread. She was safe. She was free. And she knew with absolute certainty that while the city was full of monsters, sometimes the most terrifying monster in the dark was the only one capable of standing guard over the light. The story of Theodore and Samantha is a powerful reminder that heroes rarely come in shining armor. Sometimes, salvation arrives in the form of the darkness itself, a terrifying force that chooses to be a shield rather than a sword. It teaches us that true family is not defined by blood, but by who protects you when you are most vulnerable. Theodore's unthinkable act wasn't violence. It was mercy in a world devoid of it, breaking the cycle of trauma and allowing Samantha to build a sanctuary in the light. If this story moved you, please leave a comment sharing your thoughts on Theodore's unique brand of justice. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who appreciates a gritty tale of redemption, and subscribe to our channel for more cinematic, emotionally charged stories that delve deep into the human heart.